Hello, I'm Soycat and welcome back to my second channel geography video. This is Evan's favorite series where I talk about geography and the world and stuff. And did you know that today, 50 years ago, is when Sweden decided to switch from driving on the left-hand side of the road to driving on the right-hand side of the road? This is a pretty significant change, and you can probably imagine that. The basic reason for why was because all of their neighbors drove on the right, and because people were importing cheap cars from countries that did anyway, so it kind of made sense to just kind of switch over. So despite having a 4-hour period where no one could drive on the roads at all, while people flipped over the signs, and despite having an hour where people could just like adjust and move their cars from one side to the other, this is the busiest street in Stockholm trying to deal with that switch. It was chaos, and this was a fun kind of photo that people would bring up around today. Came up on Our Europe, and whenever the argument of like, oh yeah, left hand or right hand, why do so many countries switch? The fun thing about this is this map invariably always comes up, and I love this map because one, geography means we get to talk about it, and two, because it raises a whole bunch of questions that I really wanted to answer with today's video, because you can see countries in red drive on the right hand side, and countries in blue drive on the left hand side. And although most countries drive in red, why are there still so many big pockets of countries that drive in blue? Why are they not switched over to the red? And why did, red become the standard? Well, that's what I want to explain a little bit of in today's video. Hopefully you all do enjoy. So the very first thing people are going to say is, one, they're going to argue their side of the road is better, like, well, I live in one of these red countries, therefore driving on the right hand side is better, or I live in one of these blue countries, therefore the left hand side is better. And I'll admit, I looked into a whole bunch of data, and most of it says left hand side is better, but it really comes down to different situations. Like with aging populations in general, which is a thing that's happening, left hand side has a big advantage, but there's lots of advantages to red. Whatever, let's just not deal with that right now. This is about geography, not about driving. I don't drive, it doesn't matter, I'm not going to get in a crash either way. So, yeah, with that said, let's talk about the obvious first thing you're going to say when you look at this map, and that is that, Toycat, well, obviously, this is just an easy one question over video. Why are you extending this? All you need to say is that Britain and former British colonies are just too stupid to switch over, to driving on the right hand side of the road, or if you don't think they're stupid, like, oh yeah, it's just Britain and their former British colonies, because guess what? UK, Ireland, India, we got like South Africa, we got like Australia, we got like New Zealand, all of those countries you can be like, well, it's UK, Pakistan, for instance, the Raj, British Raj, I think it is, all of these countries, they just used to belong to, the UK, and therefore, easy stuff, boom, sorted, let's move to the next video. Well, it's not that simple at all, because Japan, everyone's favorite UK colony, and like, wait, didn't America used to be owned by the UK? And wasn't Canada owned by the UK till very, very recently? So, it's not as simple as that. There's a lot of like more complexities to it, and yeah, let's get straight into talking about, I guess, the reasons for both, because that's the very first thing we should talk about, why you kind of look at this and, kind of compare the two, because it's a different projection, by the way. But the reason for this, by the way, that people do drive on the left, because that was kind of the standard, that was the default, is because back when horses were the norm and not cars, you'd get on your horse from the left-hand side of the road because you had your sword in your right, because, back in the days, you just get on your horse with your sword. That's just how people did things, right? So yeah, people would do that, and that's why driving on the left became norm. Then in France and America in particular, I don't know why only for those two countries, again, it's hard to really probably working out. It's just one of these, like, the most likely theory is that when people switch to driving with the big horse wagons, where you have like 2 lanes of horses and you're just back here, there was no left and there was no right, side of the horse, or, side of the thing to get on. So what you just did instead is you drove on the right hand side, because then, like it all made sense with the hands. Again, it's hard to like probably get down to, but it means that basically you can simplify the whole argument of like, oh yeah, which countries are which, by saying, well, the American sphere drove on the right because, they did the same thing. The France sphere did this as well, and then the British sphere stuck to the old way of things. And the reason it became, it didn't become like one harmonized system is because back then it became like a big like sticking it to the French thing, or like a big, reserving British culture over French culture by, or like, being against French culture at the very least by, driving on the left hand side of the road, because they switched to the right and they made it like a big part of their regime. So yeah, a lot of like European powers that were opposing France at the time, and Napoleonic France, basically drove on the left hand side of the road. However, eventually a lot of them fell to France, and eventually because all of their neighbors, again, like in the situation of Sweden, eventually most of their neighbors, switched, side. The more neighbors you have that have switched side, the more it makes sense. So all of Europe became that way, and then you kind of get this just big landmass where everyone switches to the right, except the countries which held out. So yeah, that's the very simple story of like how that whole thing developed and how it is now. Again, there's big arguments on which side is which, but we do know the one big thing that, you can say across all of it is that unless you need to switch, unless it makes a whole bunch of sense to, you really shouldn't, because the Sweden situation, again, like this whole mess, this is like the very least of what can happen. There's been a whole bunch of disastrous situations, and I want to talk about switching from one side to the other later, but let's talk about the countries which have remained in blue, because there's some very interesting things about where they're geographically located and why that kind of makes sense. So for instance, let's talk about first of all the UK and Ireland, because that's like the most notable example. That's the one where everyone's like, oh, you live in the UK, so you drive on the wrong side of the road, ha ha ha. And yeah, it's really easy to see why, because guess what? It's an island, or a series of islands, the British Isles, that are separated from the rest of mainland Europe, so there's no border to cross where you have to like deal with that. It's guess what? You know, they go on a tunnel, and then you can just push them out, and it all kind of works. Because although 3.5 million people do cross from France to the UK, because it is, you know, like through a tunnel, they can kind of sort it out there. There's no like extra stuff to deal with. So yeah, there you go. Separate islands, you can deal with it that way, and that's why former, you know, British islands in Europe, such as Malta. Malta over here drives on the left-hand side as well, such as Cyprus over here drives on the left-hand side of the road, but left-hand side of the road as well. And this is really fascinating because it means that although all of the former British possessions, which aren't anymore, do drive on the left-hand side, it means Gibraltar, which is part British, does not. They drive on the right-hand side of the road. I actually kind of want to prove that because like it's a fun thing to see. This is officially just a part of the UK, but as you can see from this map right here, they're driving on the right-hand side of the road because it's connected to Europe, and it just kind of makes sense that way. And interestingly, it goes the other way as well, even though the American sphere is like, oh yes, this is all about right-hand drive, and that makes kind of sense right there. American Samoa, the American Virgin Islands, the US Virgin Islands, they're called, they actually drive on the left-hand side of the road right here, because generally speaking, the thing that's a bit more powerful than the overarching country thing, so let's just go over here. Hopefully we can see a bit of road. We're like, okay, this is not a useful bit of road. This isn't even road. I don't know. I don't know how this ended up on Google Maps. Oh, this is generally one of their roads on Google Maps. Well, this is a terrible example, but they drive on the left-hand side of the road, even though it is American, because again, it's more about utility for the countries around you. It's about the vehicles you have, and that's because, you know, you sit on the left-hand side of the vehicle to drive on the right, and you sit on the right-hand side of the vehicle to drive on the left. So, yeah, with that said, now you got that kind of sorted out. How does this whole thing happen? How do you get the whole thing? So, besides islands and isolated areas, because again, you look at the next, you know, look at every country on the map that drives on the left, they're very closely grouped together. So for instance, all of South Africa around here, it's just like this big blob right here, drives on the left, and because they all drive on the left, it doesn't make sense for any one of them to switch. Then we've got, you know, Guyana and Suriname. Again, they drive on the left, and they're connected to each other, but not to their right driving neighbors besides French Guiana. The only reason French Guiana, by the way, sticks on the left is because integral French territory stuff again. So yeah, there you go. Simple enough thing. It's just like, oh yeah, small little pockets, you get that over there, then you got Australia, again, island thing again, you get like the countries over here. You only get a few odd exceptions, and my favorite weird ones are the, you know, special Chinese territories, where the only reason they've stuck on the left-hand side is because, you know, links to former colonial powers, you know, especially Hong Kong being British for so long till recently. And then also we got Thailand, which, as far as I can tell, is just one of these weird exceptions. However, the fun exception, you know, Japan, because like you can kind of argue like British influence in all of these places, besides like, you know, over here and then also up there. And Japan's the really fun one because Japan is an example of like how left-hand side traffic and right-hand side traffic is quite actually distinct from like, you know, this whole kind of thing. Because Japan, again, island nation, so they can do whatever they want really, especially back in the time. They wanted to build a railway network, and you know, you can probably work out today how much Japan loves their railways because they have the best in the world as far as I can tell, at pretty much anything. So Japan has the best railways, and they love their railways. So when they wanted to build these in the very first place, 200 years ago, they asked for a bunch of help from a bunch of foreigners. They like asked them to like all come in, the Americans, the French, and the British. And the British people won out. They built the railways, and because the British people built railways, again, railways work the same way. They built them going on the left-hand side. So that is why Japan drives on the left-hand side of the road. It's only because the British happen to have more railway expertise than the French and the Americans. Had either of them done it, Japan would drive on the right, and that's the simple enough explanation to that one. So there you go. Now you know why do countries drive on the left-hand side or the right-hand side, because it doesn't make sense to switch unless you are next to a country, you know, most of your traffic comes in from a country like that, and you're having issues with the country doing that whole thing. And in the modern day, even then, it's easy just to have like a crossing over. There's a bunch of signs, for instance, at the UK Channel Tunnel that do that, and there's a whole bunch of stuff like that. And the fascinating thing that I learned as I was going through this, because like the fact that countries switch from one side to the other, again, it's kind of cool by itself, but the really cool thing is when you look at the, you know, when you look at the way they have to connect to countries that don't. Because I mentioned that Macau, for instance, Macau and Hong Kong, again, two ex-colonial powers that are part of China, both of these drive on the left, and China drives on the right. And the other fun example is Thailand drives on the left, and its neighbors drive on the right. So to connect these countries and to make it all work just fine, they have to build like pretty ingenious, I'd say, but like interesting at the very least, traffic systems like this thing right here. So here's how Macau connects to China. They're driving on the left, and then it flips them round, it drives them all the way around there, and now they're on the right hand side of the road. And then it does the same over here, connects them later, and suddenly, like, without realizing it, you're just driving continuously, and you're on the right hand side of the road, and you just have to adjust to that. I always thought that was kind of cool, but the way better version, because this is like, oh yeah, that's kind of nice, they do some loop-de-loops, and it looks like a normal loop-de-loop, but it's like actually flipping your side of the road. The way more interesting one is this one in between Thailand and one of its neighbors, because as you can see, look, they're driving on one side, and then it does this like amazing, like it goes over and under, and then suddenly you're on the other side, and there's just, it's so fascinating to look at. I love seeing this thing, and this is how they switch the side of the traffic. You do little weird stuff, and I thought that was kind of great. So yeah, there you go. Is there a better side of the road? I mean, like, you can make your arguments. Read the comment section, because YouTube comments are really high quality arguments. But no, there hopefully is going to be some like decent arguments one way or the other. But even if there's not, I think the simplest thing is like, there's arguments for both sides, but the way bigger argument as far as any country is concerned is what do their neighbors do? What cars are they getting? You know, because if you get a bunch of cars that drive on the wrong side, it might make sense to switch. And is it worth the immense hassle? Because even though Sweden switched 50 years ago, there have been some other countries that switched since then, and it's always been a big hassle. The most recent one, by the way, just this last century, was Samoa, because all of their neighbors drove on the, which by the way was the opposite side. They used to drive on the right-hand side, and they switched to the left-hand side. So Samoa is next to American Samoa, which by the way is like Samoa, but owned by America. That's a crazy fun fact. But yeah, Samoa switched from the right-hand side to the left-hand side. So it's not all about like, oh yeah, the world's going slowly right. It's just that most of the world is right now, and not in the future. And there you go, fun fact. Maybe you didn't know it, maybe you didn't know any of the fun facts in this video, maybe you knew everything, and you're just an expert on driving, and you watch videos, so you can confirm all the stuff you already knew. I don't know. Thank you very much for watching though. Second channel, don't care, F9.